this is a really important story to tell, and to understand this is particularly now, because, as I was saying before, race is central to our story. Race, race, race. And a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of people don't want to hear about it.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the End Game. Today, I'm honored to have as a guest Terrence Moore, the author of a new book, The Real Hank Aaron, and pitch hitting for my co-host Herman Bulls. I'm happy to have Anthony Amy, who it turns out it goes way back with Terrence in their days in Atlanta. Terrence, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Terrence and I, it turns out, have been crossing paths for a long time. We didn't realize it. In 1978, the NCAA opened its basketball tournament at Market Square Arena in Indianapolis. Terrence was the senior sports editor at his paper, Miami of Ohio, and he was there to cover Miami's shocking upset of defending national champion Marquette. And I was there that same day as the sports editor of Michigan State's college newspaper for Magic Johnson's college NCAA debut, and they beat Providence. And then after that, I was working at a suburban paper in San Diego, covering the Chargers in the late 70s, early 80s. And Terrence and I were crossing paths then, didn't know it when he was covering the Raiders for the San Francisco Examiner. And then Anthony, I'm happy to have on here. It turns out Anthony and I have been crossing paths with some Twitter messages, and we have a little bit in common from Gideon Smith is Michigan State's first Black player all time. And then he went on to Hampton University and won a Black national championship there in 1922. And I've been pushing him for the College Football Hall of Fame. And that's how Anthony and I started trading some emails. Turns out Anthony's a Hampton alumnus. Welcome, Anthony.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure to fill in for Herman. Gideon Smith, as you mentioned, should absolutely be a member of the College Football Hall of Fame for what he did in his time at Hampton. In fact, one of his successors down the line, Joe Taylor, won 4 Black college national championships at Hampton during his time leading the Pirates, and was a 2019 inductee of the Black College Football Hall of Fame, and a 2020 inductee of the College Football Hall of Fame. And he'd be the first one in line to tell you that Coach Smith absolutely should be there as well.
Hey, Tom.
I've also been pushing him for the Black College Football Hall of Fame.
I got to say this real quick. Matter of fact, I never leave home without it. Miami, Ohio. A quick thing about that game. It's about 1978, Market Square Arena, number 2 ranked Marquette. Everybody was talking about, oh my goodness, they put Marquette in the same regional with number 1 ranked Kentucky. They got meet in the second round. Well, they didn't have to worry about that because Miami, Ohio beat them. But here's my greatest memory about that moment, Tom. And I don't know if you were near me on court side. But Little Miami, Ohio upsets defending champion Marquette. And I'm sitting right next to the Marquette pep band, and this woman just stands up and just passes out on the floor. It was so shocking that Miami beat them. So, it was something.
Yeah, it was a special day. Well, the reason we have you on here, Terrence, is to talk about your excellent book, The Real Hank Aaron. Talk about your relationship with Hank and your inspiration for writing this book.
Yeah, there's sort of like 3 big buckets here. Okay, and the first one involves this poster right here. Okay, this is a poster of Hank Aaron, and it's rather old because I go back a little ways. Right? I got that poster when I was 12 years old. Okay, so I went from a 12-year-old baseball fan, Hank Aaron fan, in 1968, getting that poster, to January of 2021 being an honorary pallbearer at Hank's funeral. So that just tells you about the relationship we had. And then the second big bucket is that of the symmetry between Jackie Robinson, Hank's idol, Hank Aaron, and myself as a trailblazing Black sports journalist of 45 years. I've been fortunate to have been the first in a whole slew of situations, and that has brought about the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. And then the third big bucket is me just talking about Hank Aaron, the Hank Aaron that nobody else knows about. back in the summer of 2020, Hank and I are talking, and I said, Hank, look, there have been a slew of books written about you, a slew of magazine articles, a slew of documentaries and films, but no one still knows the whole Hank Aaron, or the truth about Hank Aaron. He agreed. And that led me down this path of writing this book, 95% of which is totally new stuff about Hank Aaron. And Tom, and also Anthony, one of the things that helped me do this, which I think you guys relate to, we get in the habit sometimes as journalists, you do an interview, and then after you do the interview, you just erase over the tape, or, just move on to the next thing. And it was about the early 1990s, I started thinking to myself, this is nuts. Why am I erasing these recordings of Hank Aaron? I got some great stuff here. And so it turns out, when I got down ready to do this book, I have hours of these conversations of Hank Aaron. And one of the things that I've done, with modern technology, NFTs. And for those of you who aren't familiar with NFTs, Google, okay? So what I've done, I've got this company, and we're turning various sound clips, sound bites, I should say, what I have of Hank Aaron into these NFTs where people can buy their portion of what they want to hear with Hank Aaron. And it's just a phenomenal thing.
Anthony?
The fact, Tom and Terrence, that Hank Aaron was agreeable with you when it came to the fact that not many people knew his story and understood the real Hank Aaron, I think speaks to his humility as much as anything. The few times that I interacted with him, he always just wanted to seem like he was blending in with everybody else, when all of us knew full good and well that he was the man. He was above everybody else in the sense that he was really sort of the king of Atlanta, so to speak. We've certainly seen many examples recently of athletes who want the spotlight on them, who want all the attention on them. We see it on social media where people seemingly are begging for attention. And Terrence, Hank Aaron just seemed to be the opposite of that. That was one of my favorite attributes of him. Am I viewing that correctly? Is that sense sort of spot on, just how humble he was, really from beginning to end?
Yeah, and Anthony, there are so many examples of that, but I'm just going to start with a couple. One is, and I just mentioned, that Jackie Robinson was Hank's idol. And back on October 24th, 1972, right after Jackie died, Hank went to Willie Mays and Ernie Banks and said, now that Jackie has died, it's up to us to take over Jackie's causes. And for those who don't know, Jackie Robinson was bigger away from baseball than he was in baseball, because he was a civil rights leader. I mean, he was huge. He was LeBron James before LeBron James. He doesn't get enough credit for that, okay, in so many aspects. So anyway, so he's telling Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, and Ernie Banks, let's do that. Let's become Jackie. And Ernie and Willie wanted nothing to do with it because they thought it was going to harm their image. And so this just tells you, Anthony, about Hank's character, because Hank didn't make a big fuss about it. He just said, you know what? I'll do it myself. And then the other part of this is one of the favorite things I've ever done in my entire life as a reporter. I encountered Hank Aaron at the Atlanta airport. He didn't know it. And I just wanted to just watch him move through the terminal and to see the reaction that he would get. And this was just so typical. People, of course, everybody recognized Hank Aaron. They're coming up to him and saying, hey, how's it going, Hank? And blah, 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 or telling a story here and there, or some shedding tears. And the thing that was so striking about this was Hank took time to talk to every single person and giving his famous, with that baritone voice of his, well, thank you very much, and that kind of stuff. And he was in a hurry, but that was Hank. He just had that great patience. And I remember telling Hank about that scenario. I said, hey, Hank, I was watching around the Atlanta airport, blah, blah, blah. And then Hank let out one of those classic Hank laughs. He says, he says, sometimes I'll be in those situations and people don't know that I can hear them. And he said, I'll hear somebody say, that's Hank Aaron. I thought he was dead.
Anthony?
Well, you know what, Terrence, it's interesting because you guys both mentioned all of our ages, and Hank Aaron, as you noted in your book, spent the last couple of seasons of his historic career in Milwaukee, where it began with the Braves and ended it as a Brewer. So his final season, 1976, happens to be the year I was born. And so I don't have no recollection of seeing Hank Aaron live, of course, but he was born the same year as my father, and in 1934. And so anytime anything would happen with Hank Aaron, I would always make sure to tell my father, because they were sort of kindred spirits, if you were to listen to my father. And my dad loved Hank Aaron for many of the reasons that so many of the people you mentioned do and did. And so one of the other incredible parts about the man that sort of speaks to his humility that you pointed out in the book is that he recognized later on, I only won one MVP award. And you scratch your head when you look at all the records that he accumulated and still holds to this day. And you wonder, how in the world did he win one MVP award? If memory serves me correct, in the NBA, and again, no one is on Hank Aaron's level, but in the NBA, I think Phil Jackson won Coach of the Year one time. Greg Popovich may have only won it one or two times. And that's sort of similar to Hank Aaron, a one-time MVP. It just makes no sense whatsoever. So how much did you mentioned how he paid attention and heard everything. How much did he pay attention to the fact that he probably should have won more than he did and should have been honored more than what he was for what he did on and off the field?
Well, Anthony, I asked him point blank. I said that, what's the biggest regret you have as a player? And it was like one that he had control of and one he didn't have control over. The one he didn't have control over is what you just said right there, MVP award. And he talked about what hurt him was playing in Milwaukee and also Atlanta out of the big media markets, and that and the biased nature of the New York media, because the New York media, certainly when you start talking about writers and dominating and who votes for these type of things, and it's kind of heavily skewed that way. So as a result, the guy that he often gets compared with in history, Willie Mays, he spent a large part at the start of his career, Willie Mays, in New York, finished it in San Francisco, but still he still had those New York writers pulling for him as an example. So he had no control over that with that one MVP award. The one thing that he did have control over, and he said that this was his biggest regret, was he said that he never won the Triple Crown. And he said that, he kind of paused. He said, if I really tried, I could have won a Triple Crown. He says, I didn't try hard enough. And he said that, so that's something that always has just nagged at me, is that I should have gone for that.
So Tom, if I can just jump in, as great as he was, as much as he accomplished, there's still something nagging at him about what he wished he could have done and what he thought he could have done better. I think that, as much as anything, speaks to who Hank Aaron was.
Well, and Anthony, I got to throw this in here too, is that, and this might shock some people. Obviously, he was very proud of the 755 home runs, which is still the legitimate home run record, based on who does the story we'll talk about later. But anyway, he was very proud of the 755 home runs. But I want to tell you, probably number two of his favorite accomplishments, which shocked people, he was so proud of the fact that in 23 major league seasons, he never struck out more than 100 times.
Wow.
Now, that may not sound like a lot, anything to like the average fan, the casual fan, but for those who follow baseball nowadays, I mean, most of these guys struck out 100 times by Memorial Day.
Yeah.
So for this great slugger to not have struck out 100 times in a season, that's rather remarkable.
One of the best stories I ever read about Hank Aaron, and told you what a great player he was in the Los Angeles Times, probably sometime in the 80s. And it was talking about how when the Braves came to town, the Dodgers pitching coach would go through the lineup and they'd say, you throw it to this guy that way, this guy up and in, whatever, go through the whole lineup. They come to Hank Aaron and they'd say, just try to keep it in the park.
Right.
But the other thing while I was reading your book, Terrence, that hit me, there was the big controversy when Tiger Woods didn't show up for the 50th anniversary of Jackie Robinson, and there's no more regal woman than Rachel Robinson, and it was just embarrassing that Tiger Woods did that. Like, the whole thing could have been avoided if they'd invited the right guy, Hank Aaron. How would Hank have stood out at that ceremony?
Well, here's the thing about Tiger Woods. I've been on Tiger's case for a long time. Matter of
Oh,
fact,
my.
one of which got me on Oprah Winfrey. I mean, and then this goes back to 1997, which is around that same time period when Tiger won the Masters for the first time, and he went on Oprah Winfrey and said that he wasn't black, he wasn't white, he was Cabulasian. He invented this term, and I got on him a little bit about that, saying that in the United States of America, whether you like it or not, if a person has an ounce of black blood in them, they've always been considered to be black. That's the way this country has worked. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying that's been the mindset, and that's where people are going to treat you. And I went on Oprah to talk about that. So yeah, we're talking about Tiger has always been sort of like the Michael Jordan when it comes to race. He doesn't want to be associated, pigeonholed with race. So it very much was in keeping with his character for him not to be there for that 50th anniversary. And that was one of the greatest things I've ever experienced as a sports writer. I was there at Shea Stadium. You had the Dodgers in town, which was appropriate. Jackie Robinson's team. You had Bill Clinton was the president at the time, was there. You had other dignitaries. So for Tiger Woods not to show up there, or anybody else that had a chance to be a part of that, was beyond foolish.
Yeah. Yeah. But my point being, they should have thought of Hank Aaron.
Yeah,
to
well,
play that role.
yeah. Well, and I'm not quite sure where Hank was during that time, but there's no doubt about it. If Hank could have been there, he would have been there.
Yeah. Yeah. Anthony?
I will say this too, and this is not to defend Tiger in this instance by any stretch of the imagination, but he and I are about the same age. He's about 3 months older than I am. When you're 21, frankly, you don't have as much of a grasp on history and the moment as you should. And I think it's fair to say all of us were in that position. However, that doesn't excuse some of the people that were in his camp, including perhaps his father, and I don't know if that's fair or not, but there are people that should have understood the essence of the moment and just how dramatic and impactful that moment was, the 50-year anniversary of that. This year, of course, the 75-year anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. And there are some of those who understand the moment, some of those who don't. At 21, I just don't know that he understood how impactful that time was. But again, some of those in his camp should have.
Yeah. And that's why I say Hank Aaron was the right person, because he did understand.
Yeah, but I'm gonna say this real quick about Tiger. I'm not gonna let him off the hook, because let me tell you what this is all about. I have been on this bandwagon for a long time about how one of the things that's been detrimental to people when it comes to trying to get things solved in this country through people of prominence were the 1990s with Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley. Michael Jordan saying that the reason he wasn't outspoken in the 90s and said it in real time was because Republicans buy sneakers too. You had Charles Barkley in the early 1990s going on the commercial saying that I am not a role model. I mean, we're all role models. Well, Tiger Woods was very much in keeping with that, where he and his handlers didn't want to do anything that's going to interfere with potential endorsements. And this ties right back into Hank Aaron again, going back to October of 1972, when he approached Ernie Banks and Willie Mays. They did not want to get involved in anything or any perception in their mind that they're pro this or pro that when it came to race or civil rights or anything along those lines, because it would affect their image and potential endorsements.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to Hank's hesitancy to talk about Barry Bonds. And, 755 is the record, like you say, and I was always hoping that Hank would have been more outspoken about it. And now I understand why he didn't from reading your book, Terrence. Talk about that, how he kind of held back.
Yeah, a couple of things here. First of all, one of the things I point out in this book, people did not realize until this book how much Henry Louis Aaron was traumatized by that chase of Babe Ruth in the early 1970s. He wanted nothing to do with that memory ever again. And anytime he talked about the Barry Bonds thing, that's what would start, those old tapes would start going in his head. And matter of fact, the year leading up to the Barry Bonds chase, there was only one person they would talk to, and you're looking at him. That was it. That was it. And that's why I call myself in the book, among many reasons, the Hank Aaron whisperer. He would only talk to me because he just didn't want to deal with that. The second part, which I bring out in this book, and I'm going to get into this in a couple of ways. Hank Aaron, and it's going to sound like somewhat of a contradiction, but it isn't. He was very proud of that record, 755, breaking Babe Ruth's record of 714. But on the other hand, if he lost the record, he could care less. I mean, it could have been Ken Griffey Jr., it could have been A-Rod. I mean, it could have been Popeye, could have been the man on the moon. It was just like, all right, records are made to be broken. And I know people say that, but Hank actually believed that. He was not attached to that record, okay? But here are the two big things to answer your question about Hank and Barry Bonds. Barry as a player, Hank really didn't have a problem with, and as I point out in the book, Hank kind of evolved when it came to steroids. His point with Barry and steroids in the beginning was like, unless Barry comes out and says flatly that he used steroids to get an advantage, who am I to judge? I mean, until he says it, I got to give him the benefit of the doubt. And Hank was like that right to the end, just about. Then I would say the last 10 years of his life, he kind of changed a little bit, where he just became pretty defiant against anybody that used steroids. It was wrong in any situation. But as a whole, Barry the player didn't have a problem with. Barry the person, that's a whole other matter. He did not care for Barry the person. And as you read in the book, I got this great scene in there, and more than a scene, about when Hank calls me one day and said, hey, they want me to do this commercial. And he was talking about the Charles Schwab people. They wanted to do this commercial for the 2002 Super Bowl. And Hank said, I'm not going to do it. And I said, okay. I didn't ask any further questions. And then it was like a few days later, he said, I decided to go ahead and do the commercial. He said, and I said, well, why did you change your mind? He says, because I don't have to be anywhere near that blankety blank. Talking about Barry Bonds.
Barry Bonds, it's time. It's time to walk into retirement. Why hang around just to break the all-time home run record?
Hank, would you cut it out already?
Hank who?
Want retirement advice from someone you can trust? At Charles Schwab, you'll get expert advice that's objective, uncomplicated, and not driven by commission. To discuss your retirement plan, call 1-888-4-SCHWAB.
It's interesting, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, Terrence, but the sense that I got from Mr. Aaron and his thoughts on Bonds as he pursued 755 was, I don't want him to go through some of what I went through as I was pursuing Ruth. So even though he had his own feelings about Bonds, at the same time, again, that word humility comes back. He was humble enough to say, you know what, it's his time. I don't want to put any more pressure on him than he's already facing, even in this moment as he's about to surpass my own record.
Well, I think there was some of that, but I want to tell you something else, Anthony, that this was about. And so I also put this in the book. Hank, and I'm going to tell you something, Hank was highly intelligent, by the way, okay, and very perceptive and great wisdom. That might be a better word. And what I'm going to say next, he was exactly right. He was exactly right. He said that another reason he wanted nothing to do with that chase, which is why he refused to comment on it or made himself unavailable, except for me, of course, was he said that he was in a no-win situation. Because he said that if he's following Barry Bonds, he says, if he says one wrong word, that can be just misconstrued, like he's being jealous or envious or whatever. He said, and then he said that. Then he said he knew that by doing what he did was also controversial by not being there, which what people said was, well, he's not doing this. He's not following Barry Bonds because he's jealous of Barry Bonds. So it came down to this with Hank to tell you how strong a personality he had. He said, let them say what they're going to say. I'm not going to do it. I mean, I think it's better for me not to do it. And if they want to blast me for it, God bless them.
Okay, and then the other thing that contributed to your friendship with Hank was by the 1990s, everybody was kind of aware of the lack of black baseball players in the Major League Baseball, how it's declining. But you were onto that in the early 80s with stories, and that's how you first got your relationship started with Hank. Talk about the story you wrote and how frustrated Hank was by the lack of black baseball players.
Yeah, going back to the beginning of this conversation, I said there were 3 buckets in this book. Actually, there's 4 buckets in this book, and it's what you just brought up, and that is blacks in baseball and Hank Aaron. All right, and this is to give you a scenario. Back in 1982, when I'm working for the San Francisco Examiner, I talked management very easily into doing a series on what was happening to blacks in the game. Remember, this is 1982, all right? And what I discovered is that the number of blacks and the percentage of blacks in Major League Baseball had dropped from an all-time high of about 25% in the mid-70s to 19% in 1982. And by the way, it's 7% now. And what I discovered from talking to prominent black players, prominent white players, scouts, managers, baseball officials, all on the record, I'm very proud of this, it was all on the record, they all said back in 1982 that Major League Baseball had a quota system and was purposely phasing out African Americans, as strange as that may sound. And then I got the smoking gun. I had a white scout, matter of fact, ironically, I'm right here by my desk so I can show this to you. I had a white scout who called me, who was my deep throat. He said, I got something to show you. And what he showed me was a Major League scouting report, and I'm sure people can't actually see it, but what else put on there, there's a slot for race on the scouting report. No other sport had a slot for race on its computerized scouting report except for Major League Baseball. Why? Well, you make the call, all right? I contacted Bowie Kuhn at the time, who was the commissioner of baseball, and I kind of set him up. And I said, Mr. Commissioner, is Major League Baseball purposely phasing out African Americans? Is there a quota system? And of course, he denied it. And then I said, Mr. Commissioner, is there anything on your computerized scouting report that would say otherwise? And then he started going down the road of, oh, no, of course not, blah, blah, blah. Then he caught himself realizing that he was a lawyer. Then he said, not that I know of. So then when I sent him a fax of this thing, all hell broke loose. 26 Major League teams, memorandum sent around, immediately stopped the practice. This is where Hank Aaron comes in. Hank Aaron at the time was the only black executive in baseball. He was only the second one ever for a team. His brother-in-law was the first one back in at the end of the 1976 season. Hank became the second one. His brother-in-law died a few months after that. So in 82, Hank was the only, now let this sink in. 82, Hank was the only black person in the front office of the Major League team anywhere. So I called him in 82 and asked him about this. And I bring this up because from 1982, when I first met Hank Aaron, which started our relationship, to his death, Hank always believed that Major League Baseball was purposely phasing out African Americans. And not only did he believe that, he was telling the truth, because that has been the case. If you look at all the evidence that I've uncovered in 82, and you look at what's going on right now.
So Terrence, you mentioned that Hank and Jackie Robinson were both, really kindred spirits in a certain sense. That's something that Jackie Robinson also was really advocating for, was more blacks in baseball from a managerial standpoint, front office as well. And I'm curious to know what Mr. Aaron thought about the current day Major League Baseball. And you mentioned that number of 7% in terms of players. How much did that pain him to see the deterioration of black participation in Major League Baseball? And as you ponder the question, I'll say this. I'm a native of Washington, D.C., born and raised in D.C., and we didn't have a baseball team when I was growing up there. The Nationals did not arrive in D.C. until 2005 from Montreal. So I was an Orioles fan growing up, but then I loved the 86 Mets. And the Mets became my team. Loved Darryl Strawberry. There were so many players on that team: Darryl Strawberry, Kevin Mitchell, Mookie Wilson. You go down the line, Doc Gooden, of course. There was always representation for you to be able to see. On the Orioles, Eddie Murray, John Bembry. Again, the list goes on, and you just don't see that now. And over the course of time, my level of involvement as a fan of baseball sort of dwindled a little bit because of that. So what was Mr. Aaron's thoughts? What were his thoughts on just seeing that number continue to dwindle over the course of time?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. I like your setup there because, and I'm gonna answer that in a couple of ways. First of all, you have to understand that Hank Aaron loved baseball. I mean, loved it, watched it all the time. Matter of fact, even up in age in his 80s, he died at 86. He would even watch baseball on his computer. Yeah, Hank Aaron knew how to use a computer. I mean, he loved baseball. So this just hurt him so bad what was going on with baseball with the black players, particularly knowing that it was done on purpose. Now, this is something that I point out in my book, okay, because I know there's naysayers out there saying that, well, why would baseball want to do that? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, well, let me tell you, let me walk you through this, okay? April 15, 1947, Hank and I talked about this all the time. People got it all wrong then, and they got it all wrong now. Because the average person, you ask them, says, what did that mean when Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier? And they said, well, he proved that blacks could play baseball. No, he did not. Baseball already knew that blacks could play baseball. Baseball was terrified that blacks could play baseball. The Negro Leagues and what have you, Joe DiMaggio said Satchel Paige was the greatest pitcher he'd ever seen. So as soon as Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier, almost immediately, blacks started doing great things as far as winning MVP awards, Rookie of the Year awards, right on down the line, MVP of World Series, that sort of thing. Then we get, remember now, 47, okay, 47 broke the color barrier. Then we get quickly to the 1960s, okay? You look through the decade of the 1960s, who were the three biggest stars in Major League Baseball in the 60s, okay? Arguably Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, you can throw in Roberto Clemente or Frank Robinson or Bob Gibson. In other words, none of these people were the color of Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, or Stan Musial, okay? Then we get to the 1970s, and I was a diehard Big Red Machine fan, the greatest team of all time. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. The Big Red Machine won more games than anybody in the 70s, and they had all these Hall of Famers, and you had Pete Rose, Johnny Bench, Tony Perez, Joe Morgan, that crowd, that sort of thing. They win back-to-back World Series in 75, 76, 5 pennants they win and all that kind of stuff. Guess what? The greatest team in history of Major League Baseball, the Big Red Machine, should have been called the All-Black Machine. And this stuns people. I put in the book. Out of all the regular players on the Big Red Machines, their starting lineup, they only had 2 whites, Pete Rose and Johnny Bench. And then you get to 1970s, 1971 All-Star Game, considered one of the greatest All-Star games of all time, right there in Detroit, okay? And we're talking about both starting pitchers were black, okay? The most valuable player of the award of the game was black, Frank Robinson. The outstanding player of the game, put it that way, was Reggie Jackson, who hits the light tower in right field. He was black. They had 17 black players on that All-Star team, okay? All-Star game, I should say. Then you get to the mid-70s, the Pittsburgh Pirates did something that had not been done before or has been done since. They fielded an all-black team, all right? So you say, well, what does this have to do with anything? Well, I'll tell you what does have to do with something. 1982, that's when I discovered there was race on the computerized scouting reports. Major League Baseball made the conscious decision that this league is getting too black. It's getting away from us. People want to put that on the NBA in the 70s, but you know what? Major League Baseball had the same mindset. And so that was put in motion then to where we are today. As a matter of fact, I had several players and administrators tell me back in 82 that the game plan was, and I think of George Foster, you talk about the New York Mets. George Foster was with the Big Red Machine, went to the Mets. George Foster, which I put in the book, put as plainly as anybody, 1982, this is what George Foster said. He said, what Major League Baseball is doing is they're phasing out African Americans and phasing in Latin players because they feel that the public won't know the difference, which has proven to be true. And because Latin players are easier to deal with from a Major League Baseball standpoint with the white establishment and cheaper to deal with. And so what do we have in 80 right now in 2022? We're seeing that the numbers are way flipped, way more Latin American players. We already told you what's going on with African Americans.
Yeah.
Tom, if I can just follow up with one more note and sort of an asterisk to this point, Terrence. It's not just the lower number in terms of percentage of African American players, front office, managers, but also something that I recently have done projects on over the last couple of years. in the broadcast booth as well. And so when you look at the broadcast booth, a guy that you probably know, Terrence and Tom, I know that you're aware of as well, Dave Sims is the only television play-by-play, black play-by-play announcer for a major league team.
Yeah.
Dave Sims is with the Seattle Mariners, and he's the only one that you see. So there are a couple of others who do radio in Houston and St. Louis, but Dave is the only one that you see 162 games a year when you flip on the TV. And I've talked to Dave about this a number of times, but that's something that matters. It matters to people to be able to flip on and see, because like it or not, fair or not, there's a connection that's felt or not felt when you turn on the television. And of course, in this day and age with social media, you see everything, and there are different avenues to seeing what there is. So baseball claims that it wants more participation. Major League Baseball claims it wants more participation from African Americans. There's a way to do it, and what they're doing right now is not it. I don't know if the effort, will change, if there will be an advanced effort to attempt to attract more, but what they're doing right now, and according to you, Terrence, over the last 40 years, it just has not been it. So that's something that Major League Baseball will have to contend with. And again, I wish I could ask Mr. Aaron myself as far as what he thinks about all of this today, but certainly understand your point in saying that this has been a process over the last 40 years.
Well, I can answer your last point in two ways, Anthony. Number one, I'll tell you what Hank thought about this. That was done on purpose, because it was done on purpose. I'm talking about everything with the phasing out of black players. And Hank and I talked even about everything, including what you're talking about right there when it comes to the media. Okay. One of the reasons why he was very attracted to me was being the trailblazing black journalist I've been through the years. I mean, the first at so many things. But the other thing too, to point out from a media standpoint, which I mentioned on your former network, the Black News Channel, I brought this up, that nobody else wants to talk about this, is that ESPN is a microcosm of society. Okay, you look at ESPN, and when I talk about ESPN, I'm not just talking about ESPN, I'm talking about media, and I'm talking about society. If you look at, by and large, outside of an Anthony Amy when he was at ESPN News, if you want to be on ESPN for any consistent basis as far as a broadcaster, what have you, you've got to be, as a black person, you got to be a former athlete or former coach, or you got to be totally outlandish, not mentioning any names, okay? And then if you are white, you're allowed to be just a normal person, a regular reporter, just happen to be good at your craft, by and large. And for people who don't believe me, spend 30 minutes watching ESPN to see what I'm talking about, okay? All the screamers, all the outrageous people are former black athletes, and show me the journalists that are just normal. So then people say, well, what is this all about? Well, I call it the Jimmy the Greek thing. I'm old enough to remember Jimmy the Greek, and I wrote about this in real time. Back in 1986, Jimmy the Greek got fired by CBS, and Jimmy the Greek, for people who don't know, he was an NFL analysis for CBS, NFL football analysis, odds maker, I should say, or odds or whatever you want to call it, gambler for CBS, and he was on the mornings, the CBS Sunday NFL shows for forever. But he got in trouble, Jimmy the Greek, when he told a TV announcer being interviewed at lunch some things about race. And most people will tell you that the reason Jimmy the Greek got fired in January 1986, because he said that the reason there are so many dominant black athletes is because their mothers bred them that way, going back to slavery. All right. That's not why Jimmy the Greek got fired. Not in my opinion. I saw the whole interview. Jimmy the Greek later said in that interview, when he was asked, he said, Jimmy, so why do you think there aren't that many or any black NFL head coaches at the time, black managers or executives or what have you? And Jimmy the Greek's response was, because if we give those jobs to the blacks, there wouldn't be anything left for the whites to do.
Yeah, that's right.
I contend that a lot of this has to do with that. Going back to Major League Baseball, the 60s, the dominant black players, the 70s, the dominant black players. Oh my goodness, we got to stop this. Okay. And then if you start giving jobs in the media to the Anthony Amy's of the world, as opposed to the fill in the blank, I'm talking about of the world, it's like, oh, there won't be anything else for us to do, because we should be allowed to just to be normal.
Yeah. Interesting. This is where I drew a correlation with your series about your part in the book about declining Black players in baseball. In my research for my book, Ray of Light, about how Michigan State led college football integration, is people don't realize that through the 60s, schools had unwritten quotas limiting their Black players to about a half dozen. And Duffy Daugherty smashed that with, he recruited anybody. And a perfect example of that is the 1966 game of the century. Michigan State had 20 Black players, 11 Black starters, 2 Black team captains elected by a predominantly white team, College Football Hall of Famers George Webster and Clinton Jones, and then Jimmy Ray is the South's first Black quarterback to win a national title. Notre Dame had 1 Black player, Alan Page. And that wasn't that unusual because in USC in 1962 won the national title with only 5 Black players. And in 1967, they won the national title with only 7 Black players. Los Angeles, with its population and diversity, you have to work at keeping your numbers down to that. Exactly. And so eventually schools started to follow what Duffy's example was. But the correlation I made with those, Terrence, was that because those handful of Black players at USC or whatever were running back scoring all the touchdowns, people weren't aware that there weren't that very many Black players. And to a certain extent, that's true today, because even though there are very few Black players in Major League Baseball, the ones at the top of the stats are Black or Hispanic Black.
Yeah, I love that. The only thing I don't like what you said, Tom, being a person who was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana, home of the University of Notre Dame, 1966. Well, we did win the national championship anyway. But to answer your question, which brings me to something else, is that historically, when you look at not only baseball, but sports or what have you, or life, again, sports is a microcosm of society, as baseball is, that by and large, with media, unless you are just so outstanding as a Black person, you're not going to get a chance, okay? From a white perspective, not so much, okay? And one of the things in 1982, I remember talking to this minor league statistician. It was legendary, Mr. Weiss. I can't think of his first name at the time, but he was around for like 40 or 45 years. And he said something back then about what was going on with Major League Baseball that not only applied to baseball, but applied to, as you say, college football, sports, life. He said that he started noticing through the years that when a team, he's talking about minor league teams, because again, minor league players end up being major leaguers. He said, start look at minor league teams, that if there was a choice between a marginal Black player and a marginal white player, they always took the marginal white player. Yeah. If you were, anybody can pick a Willie Mays or Hank Aaron, but if you're like a Jerry Royster, not so much. Okay. And that's exactly what you're talking about there with college football, but it also applies to everything in life.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a great discussion. Anthony, I'll let you bring us home.
Well, it's interesting, Tom, you mentioned coach at Michigan State and just obliterating the quota system there. And I can't help but think about a conversation I had with my wife recently, and this is not an old topic. And Terrence, this is something Terrence and I have discussed in part before. And again, this is something that I would wonder what Hank Aaron would think about this. Considering what's going on in the country, the leverage that some of these athletes have now is something that they are not aware of. And it's something that I'm sure Hank Aaron was aware of when he was a player, and certainly after his playing career. So there are no more quotas in college football now, or in college sports in general. But if some of the young men, and what sparked this thought in my head was hearing someone say, "We need you, men," based on what the Supreme Court has ruled in the past week. We need you. And I thought about it and I said, you know what? If some of these elite athletes, even thinking back to the 1960s and prior to that, when there were quota systems, if some of these elite athletes said, you know what, I'm not going to go and play for the predominant schools, the elite schools that are in some of these states that are agreeing to some of these laws, I'm not even going to consider them. They're professional athletes who are free agents that I'm not even going to consider playing for the teams in those states. How quickly would those states reconsider what they're doing? And it's just to kind of bring to tie a bow on it in terms of, again, the quota subject and what Michigan State did in the 1960s to what athletes have now in terms of leverage. It's something that Hank Aaron understood. It's something that we need more people like a Hank Aaron to help some of the younger people who aren't getting it to understand you have leverage in ways that you don't seem to understand right now. So I'm just curious as to, and I'll throw this out to Terrence for old time's sake, Terrence, what do you think he would have thought in a situation like this one, where it seems as if the players of today, college and professional, don't seem to understand the leverage that they have?
Well, Anthony, I'm going to answer that in a way that might surprise you and surprise a lot of people. And I'm going to do this way. There's a reason why there has been only one Hank Aaron. There's a reason why there's only been one Jackie Robinson or Muhammad Ali, or even getting away from sports. Okay, there's a reason why there's only like one Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And get away from race. Let's go to there's a reason why there was only one Abraham Lincoln. Okay, there are only a handful of people in the history of the world who have the moral aptitude, the put it in more just plain language, the guts and the visibility and the means to say, to heck with what's going on around me, I'm going to do the right thing. I got the power to do the right thing, that actually do it. Because if it were that easy, we would have more people doing it. So that's the way I look at it. And this is where I have evolved. I mean, yeah, I wish these people would do better, but I also wish I had $1 billion, okay? And so I'm almost to the point now where I have gotten to be more appreciative, and going back to the man of the moment, of a Hank Aaron than ever before, because he was a guy, he was that Jackie Robinson, that Abraham Lincoln, that Muhammad Ali, that won in whatever, a million, whatever, that was able to do it, as opposed to me worrying about why does Michael Jordan have the attitude he has right here? Why is it that these guys don't get it? They obviously don't have the means to do that, mentally, physically, and spiritually, which is also what makes these other guys so special in life and in history.
Okay, thanks everybody for tuning in. Visit my website, tomshanahan.report, and buy Terrence's book, The Real Hank Aaron.